Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second lecture for this week, focusing on gender performance. So, just to kind of backtrack a little bit, and to the last lecture, we talked about the social construction of gender, presented by Judith Lorber, in which she talks about how gender is a product of society, not biology, and that gender is constructed through daily interactions that we have with just pretty much both physically, the people that we interact with, but then also like via social media, text, and so forth. We're all performing gender. And also that then these ideals around gender norms, rules, roles, all of that are reinforced through institutions like education, laws, policies, media, of course, and as well as culture, right? And that we are constantly doing gender in that we perform gender. We might not know that we're performing it, but we're doing it. And we definitely know when we have failed at performing our gender because we get checked by the people around us. We are made to feel embarrassed, ashamed, scared, or even worse sort of circumstances where we are violently attacked because we're not fulfilling a gender role. And again, doing gender is really much, both being regulated by outside by society, but also internally, So it's again what is expected of us and how we think we should be, and that then determines how we are acting out our gender, how we're doing our gender. So the second Judith that we're talking about this week is Judith Butler, who is well known, both within feminist women's studies, but also obviously, of course, queer studies. She is considered to be a founding contributor, theorist, thinker in the field. And her sort of first sort of seminal work came out in 1990 called Gender Trouble. And in Gender Trouble, she uh, builds upon the idea of the social construction of gender, but adds more to it. In that she argues that the distinction between sex as a natural given category and also that gender as an acquired cultural social category. So she's building upon these two distinctions as well as challenging them. Because Butler argues that sex, what we think of sort of like natural, biological, something that's there, and that gender is a socially constructed thing. Well, Butler argues that sex is also socially constructed, and that both sex and gender work to maintain this illusion of heterosexual integrity. What is the illusion of heterosexual integrity? Basically, it's the myth according to which someone who is born with certain genitals, let's say a penis, right? And therefore, then they are born with this penis, so then they therefore naturally will assume this gender identity, right? Being masculine, male, because we assume we contribute penis with masculinity and maleness, even though you do not have to be a man or exhibit maleness, masculinity, and so forth, and have a penis, but still, we naturally put this assumption together that penis equals male. And then also, not in addition to that, not only penis equals a gender identity, but that penis equals not only gender identity, but also a sexual desire, which is directed toward the opposite sex, women, heterosexuality. And so this perception, this sort of heterosexual, this illusion of heterosexual integrity, assumes that there is this congruence between sex, male and female, biology, gender identity, man, woman, male, female, masculinity, femininity, and the object of sexual desire, that they all go hand in hand. And what Butler does in her work is very much question the naturalness, the stability, and the consistency of this. Essentially, she's addressing what we addressed actually last week around heteronormativity and cisnormativity. Again, assuming that heterosexuality is the norm and natural, and that everybody is heterosexual by default, and then therefore anybody who's outside of that is like, seen as at worst, criminal, deviant, or at least worst, because it's all bad, as being like, oh yeah, there's that other option. But, the normal way is, to be heterosexual. And cisnormativity, that you identify with the gender assigned to you at birth, which again, Butler very much questions this assigning of gender on biology, on sex, because it is itself a socially constructed category. And that gets into what Butler contributes to this conversation, because very similar to what Lorber was talking about, Butler also supports the idea that gender is performative, that it is a performance. It is not something that is innate or natural. But Butler adds to this by saying that sex and sexuality is also performative. Butler's contribution to the discussion around gender performance by saying that also not only that gender is performed, but also that sex and sexuality is performed, is a direct uh, critique towards feminism as well as women's studies that still, even to this day, sometimes goes into very essentialist notions around gender. Because even when gender is acknowledged by feminist thinkers, writers, theorists, and so forth, as well as many other theorists, as well as sociologists, psychoanalysis, etc., even when gender is acknowledged as a social construction, it is still perceived, according to Judith Butler, as a manifestation of some sort of core identity and a true sexuality of the self. Butler says that, that when we sort of think of gender identity as this inner truth, we ignore the fact that gender, there is no sort of core gender somebody is born with. Instead, there's no sort of inner truth. And even when we do acknowledge that gender is a social construction, we still hold on to this idea that, well, there's still an essential core gender self. And in fact, Butler argues that no, in fact, gender is a product of a stylist repetition of actions, i.e., gender performance. Like, we can't say that gender is socially constructed and still hold on to this idea that there's this sort of core gender identity. No. Instead, if gender is a social constructed, then all sort of ideas around gender, both even how we think of our gender, is a performance. And in that notion of gender performativity, Judith Butler argues that our sexual identity is also a display, that it is also a performance that we constantly act out. And this performativity includes a wide range of behaviors, from the way we talk, the way we walk, perform certain rituals, actions, and so forth. And that we are, just like how we're performing gender, we're also performing sex and sexuality throughout the course of our lives. And that this performance, this sexual performance, is what constitutes the meaning of masculine or feminine identities. And it gets back into, again, what I was previously talking to about the illusion of heterosexual integrity, right? This idea that, again, that a person is born with a certain sex, again, that sex is biological, that it's natural, and then also with that, then they will be a gender, right? That, biology equals gender, and then that they will then both exhibit, perform, act on a certain sort of sexual desire identity. Butler criticizes this idea of this core essential self, again, around gender, but also around sexuality. That there isn't this sort of thing that people are born naturally heterosexual or homosexual, but in fact, that the body itself is sexless and can display multitudes of sexual desires and orientations and identities, and both not only just sort of physical sexual, but also romantic and many various combinations of that. And in this, then, Butler argues that this sort of, again, this idea of this illusion of heterosexual integrity, this idea of this sort of seemingly natural division of man and woman, is founded, again, on this belief regarding heterosexuality and this sort of forced and constant regulation of sexuality within the boundaries, the very limited boundaries of heterosexuality, and that anything outside of that, even, people who are sexually attracted to people of the opposite sex, right? Heterosexuality, but deviates in any sort of way, maybe they might be attracted to also people of the same sexuality, or romantically attracted to some and sexually attracted to others within the gender spectrum, are seen as being abnormal, right? Because again, this sort of emphasis on heterosexuality, a very narrow, limited definition of heterosexuality as being the norm. And with this, you know, Butler ties in the conversations we've had around gender performativity to sexual performativity, and that performative masculinity and femininity are defined through heterosexual sexuality and heterosexual power dynamics and relationships, romantic stories, and so forth. And in that, then they serve to ratify this, again, this allegedly naturalness of this normative sexuality, heterosexuality, while marginalizing other options of sexualities, desires, identities, and behaviors which are cast outside of this very limited definition. So it's not only that we are performing our gender, but we're also performing it within the confines of heterosexuality, which does produce certain scripts around that, one, that you are going to be attracted to somebody of the opposite sex, but then also power dynamics, that the guy should be aggressive or the wooer and the woman should be the passive or submissive. And even when you don't identify as heterosexual, you identify as gay, lesbian, pansexual, many other sexuals, right, besides heterosexual, you're still having to work within the sort of cultural norm that heterosexuality is the norm and everything included in that. So it is very restrictive. A great example of this is how bisexual people are treated in the society, and especially with the idea of a bi erasure, meaning that bisexual people are either erased as being like, well, they are either questioning or they're not really a sexual orientation or identity, or that they are dismissed completely for their thoughts and feelings. Um, and this happens. What's important, why bisexual erasure is a good example of what Butler's talking about, is that this happens both within, let's say, the straight world, which again, that's a large blanket statement, but let's say for heterosexual mainstream world, but also within, under the umbrella of the queer community, where there's a lot of what is considered biphobia or bi discrimination, where bisexual people are seen as either not being a part of the queer community or not being truly a part of the queer community, to also seeing or having their identities dismissed completely. And there's a lot of ways that bi erasure happens, both within, we can talk about examples of the media in regards to bisexual people either being cast as like hypersexual people or deviant bad people. It seems like that's a character that's always happened in the media. But to also, discrediting people who do come out as bisexual, such as Lady Gaga or Alan Cumming. Alan Cumming has had relationships with both men and women. He's been in a long-term relationship with another man for many years, but he still identifies as bisexual. Yet people oftentimes question that or criticize that, is that he's not actually really bisexual. He was always gay, even though he, had multiple relationships with women prior to his marriage. But, so bi erasure is sort of a way to talk about how this illusion of heterosexual integrity works to erase, discredit, and discriminate against individuals who might have heterosexual relationships, but also might have um, desires, past, present relationships, both sexual, romantic, whatever, to people of the same sex. And it's again, a way of talking about how when we think of heterosexuality and gender as these natural, innate things, we create a binary, both a gender binary, of male and female and nothing in between. And that they're very, very, everybody's just naturally into those two camps. to also the camps of heterosexuality, homosexuality, and that that there's no gray area, even though sexuality in itself is a spectrum. And we're seeing that more and more, especially with younger generations of people are coming out more and more as LGBT or as accepting. And I think that speaks to, again, of this loosening of our, or hopefully challenging of our ideas of this sort of sexual binary that you're either one or the other camp, and instead talking about sexuality, desires, love, attractions, and so forth on a spectrum, and that you can be a completely secure heterosexual man and find another man attractive, maybe even desire another man. You're still, you can still be heterosexual and have that as well. Hopefully, it's getting a little bit better around that. Getting back to gender performance, at the core of Butler's argument, she is saying that your gender is constructed through your own repetitive performance of gender. And performativity of gender is a stylized repetition of acts and imitation or a miming of the dominant conventions of gender. And in this, she argues that there is not a stable and coherent gender identity. There isn't this sort of core inner truth of gender that's always been there and always will be. Instead, it's performed. That the body itself is not gender. There's not a gender sense of self within the body, but instead, we are always performing. And then we think that we have a core self because in this performance, it's seen as natural. It's sort of again reinforces the idea that gender is innate or natural. But in fact, there is no sort of core gender. The body itself is not gendered. And therefore, then, as Butler says, to say that gender is performative is to argue that gender is real only to the extent that it is performed. And that when we act on our gender, it's not something that we, again, came out naturally and we just started to perform it. But instead, this performance around gender has been happening way before we entered the scene. And in fact, a lot of us learned about how we should perform our gender through watching the people around us, our parents, our families, our friends, our media, our education, and so forth. And therefore, as she says right here, the act one does, the act that one performs, is, in a sense, an act that's been going on before one arrived on the scene. So, again, that gender is not something that is naturally innate, but instead has been performing way before we even started to do our own performance of gender. And that gender essentially is drag, right? It's an impersonation. Becoming gendered involves impersonating an idea that nobody actually inhabits. Because if we do not have this sort of core gender self, this inner self that is gendered, instead, then nobody inhibits, a gender, right? But we're all acting out as if we do, or as if someone does. In reality, doesn't exist. But the other thing, again, that Butler emphasizes is that biological sex is also a social construction. Now, we talked a little bit about this in the last lecture around, sex in itself is a construction. That, that sort of division between gender is, masculinity, femininity, social, and sex is biological, physiological, anatomical, genetics. And in fact, the way that we maybe are thinking about sex is also a construction. A great example of this, and it's not an article that we're reading for this class, but is one that ties very nicely into this discussion, is the classic one of Edith Martin, who actually produced this a year later after Butler's famous gender trouble, called The Egg and the Sperm: How Science Has Constructed a Romance Based on Stereotypical Male-Female Roles. And in this piece, she looks at basically medical texts and how they're describing insemination. I mean, basically the moment when the semen enters the scene, the egg is deposited in the uterus and so forth, and then, insemination occurs. And what she notices that in all these medical texts is that there is so much gendered language because it's not only that they're describing a pretty basic biological process, right? That happens with, with mammals and so forth, right? Of egg and sperm and so forth. But instead, um, these items, an egg and a sperm, are put into a gendered performance. And what she notices is that a lot of the literature out there talks about the egg waiting passively or being receiving or being submissive while the sperm is being aggressive or fighting through in order to dominate or in order to capture the egg. And in these sort of, roles that are assigned to things that don't have gender. A sperm does not have a gender, an egg does not have a gender, right? Yet, when you Google images of egg and sperm, yeah, you'll get some of the old, what I showed before, this image, right? But a lot of other images like this, right? Where it's a courtship, right? Where the egg always seems to have a bow and eyelashes because I guess an egg is always female. And then the sperm is either courting her with, I guess the sperm went to a very tiny flower shop and got that rose, or something even more aggressive where the sperm looks like he's going to sexually assault the egg as she waves a little delicate handkerchief. And again, the reason why I'm giving this example is that eggs and sperm don't have a gender. They don't. Yet we assign this gender role, and it's very troubling, especially for individuals who might not be biologically assigned male, but or who may be biologically assigned male who don't produce sperm and maybe produce eggs, or vice versa for women who do not produce eggs but maybe produce sperm, or a combination of that, or varying degrees. There's a wide variety in regards to display of reproductive organs and care, and that you have people who might be able to have egg and sperm production, to having people who might have anatomically classified male body parts, a penis, even though a penis shouldn't be seen as male because it's just a penis, but not be able to produce sperm, vice versa for vagina and so forth, right? Yet we have forced gender onto sex so much that something that should really have no gendered story, egg and sperm, produced by a wide variety of people regardless of their gender, um we've created this sort of myth of romance, this sort of myth of gendered relationships when they do not exist. Of course, there are many other examples, right, that I've talked about before. For example, a nipple, right? you know Whereas if it's classified as a male nipple, it can be shown publicly, whereas if it's classified as a female nipple, it has to be blurred out or covered up. And but it's a nipple, and who cares? I mean, it makes no difference. It serves the same function. It's the same piece of flesh, yet the minute that we put a gender onto it, the minute that we think about it through a gender lens, which we'll inevitably always do, then we then treat it very differently. Legs are another example, right? Legs are just how to get you to places. They really shouldn't have a gender, yet they are heavily regulated, right? Especially for individuals who may identify as being a woman or assigned being a woman. A lot of scrutiny over being shaving your legs and so forth. But even nowadays, in fact, men are being scrutinized around being shaving their legs. So it's interesting. But this is all just to sort of say that biological sex in itself, all the sort of things that we think about genetics and natural, that people are born this certain way, are in fact, always interpreted through a lens of gender. And so therefore it is also socially constructed. The way that we think of certain pieces of flesh versus, is very much dependent on the gender we assign to that flesh. the gender that we assign to that biological process, like reproduction, right? It creates a narrative that we then think is natural, but in fact has been very much socially constructed. And in this, then, Butler talks about, so if biological sex is also social construction, and gender is a social construction, and sexuality is a social construction, then really all this is working to is to, again, maintain the illusion of heterosexuality, the illusion of heterosexual integrity. And again, this ideology that heterosexuality is the norm, that it should always be and always will be, that gender is natural and innate, and that, as with cisnormativity, that being cisgender is the norm, which it is not, and that in fact, that bodies can exhibit a range of genders because the body itself does not have a gender. We instead are forced to perform a gender, just the same way as sexuality. A body has a range of sexual desires, attractions, romances, all of that, acts, physical capabilities, etc. But we, as a society, regulate that performance. This gets us back to performance versus performativity. So, getting back to Butler's main arguments around that gender identity is a performance. And in this, she is undermining the distinction between gender and sex, which again, we've talked about that in fact, this division between, that a lot of us, and I'm talking about instructors do, where we say, well, sex is biological and gender is cultural or social. Truth is that they're both socially constructed. Both sex and gender are socially constructed. And it gets to, again, criticizing this idea of this naturalness around that people are born with certain sex characteristics, let's say, for example, a penis, and then therefore then they are male, again, assigning a gender to them, and then also then they desire people of the opposite sex, women, i.e. they're also heterosexual. And this is the natural order of things. And anybody who falls outside of that line are seen as abnormal, deviant, or worse, right? Instead, Butler argues that, first of all, that has no real basis in reality. And in fact, the body itself is genderless and sexless, and therefore can express a multitude of gender identities, gender expressions, sexual identities, sexual expressions, desires, and so forth. That we shouldn't be sort of limiting to, again, this illusion of heterosexual integrity. But the reason why, again, that we think of this, that we, feel like that this is the natural order of things, and how maybe we even feel constricted by it, is because of these sort of dominant gender norms and rules that maintain this idea of the gender binary, right? That you're either born male or female, as well as the sexual binary, that you should be born heterosexual, and if you fall outside of it, then you're deviant and worse. And that, the supremacy of both being, cisgendered, heterosexual, and so forth. So that essentially is around gender identity as a performance. Performativity of gender is focusing more on how individuals can subvert this idea of the naturalness around gender and sexuality and sex. And this is where Butler looks a lot at drag, looking at drag performance and how that drag performers really subvert both gender norms and ideals around masculinity and femininity, but also show kind of clearly how gender is a performance. And in this, then, as Butler says, drag is subversive to the extent that it reflects on the intimate structure by which hegemonic gender is itself produced, and disputes heterosexuality's claim on naturalness and originality. So We're going to talk a little bit more about drag in the next couple of slides, but this is just sort of where Butler is getting her arguments, is that she's looking at drag and she's seeing how drag performances work to subvert gender norms and as well as sexual norms, and really sort of proving her idea that the body itself, there is no sort of core gender or sexual identity, and in fact we can express multitudes of that, and that we should not be limited to one or the other. So I'm going to now go into a little bit about the history of drag. One, because we're going to be watching a movie on a very important history, time, sort of cultural history on a specific period of drag, but also to give you a good sort of historical lesson on a cultural art form that has been incredibly influential here in our world. So drag in itself is a slang term that refers to wearing of clothing of the opposite sex. Again, working on a gender binary here. The history of individuals dressing up in different gendered clothing for entertainment, pleasure, and commerce has been around forever and has been expressed in multitude of cultures around the world. So it's not just, uh, here in the West. And a lot of times, the reasons why drag was happening back then was that women themselves were barred from performing, participating in dramatic performances. And so, therefore, male performers needed to dress up as women in order to portray women characters. Shakespeare, for example, is a classic example of this, where, the Shakespeare stuff that we read now, Romeo and Juliet, Juliet would have been played by a young boy or a young teenager, sort of feminine looking guy. The drag that we enjoy today had its start in the 1600s when King Charles II lifted the curtain on gender restrictions on stage, at last allowing women to play themselves. And over the next couple of decades, it became popular for women to portray male characters. Um, Oftentimes, it was called the breeches role. And back in Britain, although men were no longer required to play female characters, they still carried out the custom at times, a lot of times for comedic rather than dramatic effect. And instead of men attempting to look convincingly like women on stage, back during Shakespeare, Juliet needed to look beautiful in order for Romeo to fall in love with her. Now, the British theaters sort of started this idea of pantomime, evolving around masculine looking actors feigning effeminacy for laugh, while a female actor played a young male protagonist. And this sort of started this idea around that drag is not only about impersonation, but also critique and ridicule around gendered norms. So then these male actors would start taking very hyper realistic um, portrayals of women, to the point of, of course, for comedic effect, but also as a way to sort of critique around gender stereotypes. And women as well, female actors who were playing male characters, also took heightened versions of masculinity to, again, portray these underlying gender norms that everybody knew about and was kind of taken for granted, but we could laugh at it as well as critique it in that laughter. Before the rise of urban centers and movie theaters in the US, traveling vaudeville shows were one of the most popular forms of family friendly entertainment. And alongside, really silly acts like ventriloquists and acrobats, pantomime, again, this idea of this pantomime performance, allowed for drag performances, were also very popular. And although these early drag entertainers intended to mock rather than emulate their put on heroines, the campiness of their routines would endure into the sort of the idea of the glamour drag show that evolved into more direct female impersonation. Unfortunately, at the turn of the century, homophobic, anxieties over men dressing up as women didn't stoke much public complaint, but as gay men gradually came out of the closet, drag became much more closely linked with homosexuality and transitioned to an underground, more of an art form. As a byproduct of prohibition and the rise of illegal speakeasies in the 1920s and 1930s, gay men also found new places to congregate away from sort of the prying eyes of the law, and larger US cities like Chicago and New York experienced a sort of so called what they were called pansy craze, and more bars catering exclusively to gay clientele. Along and in that, there were a lot of drag performances that sprang up. A noted drag queen pictured at the left was Harry S. Franklin, with another was a very much a popular performer during that time, and he did a lot of glamour drag, doing kind of burlesque s shows and so forth. So by the 1950s, police had been cracking down on gay friendly establishments and enforcing anti cross dressing laws in New York, and as well as many other major cities. And for instance, men were legally obligated to wear no fewer than 3 pieces of male clothing in order not to be arrested for drag. Women is the same way. They had to wear no fewer than 3 pieces of female clothing in order to not be arrested for drag. And this was again happening amid intensifying anti gay hostility. But out of this, repression where people were literally being arrested on the street for wearing clothing that was not assigned to the gender, not that was not, the gender of their that was assigned to them, you also had a lot of community growth. One was the creation of the imperial courts, which were these courts that still exist today that are very popular and very powerful, of drag queens, drag performances. Oftentimes, they would raise money for the LGBT community. In 1965, Jose Soria proclaimed herself the Empress of San Francisco and laid the foundation for the formation of the first imperial court ever to exist in the United States, the Imperial Court of San Francisco. Today, the court system, which is now international, has over 65 chapters in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and making it the second largest LGBT organization in the world, and has donated hundreds and thousands of dollars to the LGBT community, particularly around HIV and AIDS resources and awareness and so forth. They have been the court system has been the backbone to the LGBT community that oftentimes does not get enough attention and is often ignored for the amount of activism that they do. So, getting back though to the criminalization of cross-dressing. Cross-dressing and drag performance, did exist as an underground culture for most of the 20th century, and the visibility of drag queens, though, increased alongside that of the LGBT communities in the late 1960s. When the infamous Stonewall riots occurred in 1969 at the New York Stonewall Inn, one of the city's only gay bars at the time, homosexual acts were illegal in every state but Illinois. And on June 28th, New York City police officers in 1969 raided the bar to seek to arrest homosexual patrons and also arresting those who were cross dressing. Again, because these laws were very much enforced. And when the crowd decided to fight back instead of, capitulate, high heeled wearing drag queens were on the front lines of this 6-day skirmish that officially signaled the start of the gay rights movement in the US. So a lot of the progress that has been made on the heels of drag queens. But it's also important that, I think when we talk about drag, that we talk a lot about drag queens because, they're very much the more popularly known form of performance, but drag kings have been also around since the very beginning. Now, while the term drag king was first cited in print in 1972, there's a longer history of female performers dressing in male attire. In the theater, as I said before, in the opera, as I said before, there was the breeches role, but there were also many other performers. One that I would love to talk about just a minute is Stormy DeLavery, who was a butch lesbian and performed in male drag alongside with female impersonators through the 50s and the 60s. De La Veere was also a veteran of the Stonewall riots. And much like drag queens, drag kings often take on a playful names to reflect their stage personas. Sexual based names like Smack Diaz are common, as also macho names like Stanley Knife, Razor Blade. Similar to the practice of drag queens joining houses, kings will also often join troops, practicing, performing, and traveling together. And some drag kings have become very popular performers within the LGBT community, especially among lesbians who admire the sort of bravado of reclaiming male and female gender roles. And there's so many that we could talk about, but I just sort of want to state this is that it's not only drag queens, but drag kings who were also taking upon this mantle and doing such amazing performances and work, as well as activism in their performances. We are going to be exploring a little bit of a subsection of drags. Um, Again, this presentation that I'm talking about, this very brief history of drag, it doesn't really point out to the fact that drag in itself is an umbrella term. And then, in fact, there's many other sort of subcultures within the drag community. One that we're going to be focusing on is on drag balls, the ball scene within inner city New York, predominantly coming out of mostly working class black queer communities within the New York area. Now, drag balls have become a cornerstone within African American drag queen communities. Similar to the fraternity system, up and coming drag queens would join up with local houses headed by older, experienced drag queens known as mothers or fathers, who helped groom young members in their drag pursuits and offer moral and social support along with shelter. They were literally like their families if they'd been kicked out of their homes and so forth. Periodically, drag queens and kings from various houses would then meet up and to face off in what was called a ball that would feature walk-offs, performances between contestants competing in categories such as like for example femme queen, male face, soldier, chola, empire or dynasty, college graduate and so forth. And you're going to be looking at those categories in Paris is Burning. I just want to point this out is one is that this is just an example of the beautiful variety within drag culture, but also that drag balls in themselves have had such a significant impact not only within drag culture but also within popular culture. For those of you familiar with Madonna and voguing, that came directly out of the drag balls. In fact, Madonna would attend these balls in the 80s and watch the performers do voguing, which is this stylized dance form, and use that and actually hired people from the drag ball scenes to then choreograph her Vogue video and her tour directly after that. And voguing has become a part of the cultural mainstream, and we know about it and so forth. So that's just an example, and you're going to explore this a lot more in Paris is Burning, but I just wanted to mention this here. Of course, drag has become very popular and much more mainstreams with RuPaul's Drag Race. And you have now people who never knew about this culture and all those complexities of the culture and the varieties of the culture now getting involved. But of course, they're going it through the lens of RuPaul and her teaching of it. So that's just to say that on one hand it's been a really great benefit of like the social acceptance of drag culture, but at the same time it's also a very limited lens and doesn't show the wide variety that there is within the larger umbrella of drag. And also, as I want to get back to and what Butler talks about is that yes, drag is subverting gender identity, but it's really important that it to state here that it comes at a cost. It comes at a cost with regards to a lot of violence and a lot of social abdication, disdain, discrimination, marginalization. And that, Butler definitely doesn't want to say that just because we perform our gender doesn't mean that it's automatic or that it's easy. And that even when we try to subvert our gender, that it's easy. That it's something that we could just decide the next morning to be like, I'm going to subvert my gender. Instead, it comes with a lot of risk, a lot of violence, and a lot of, unfortunately, deaths for those who step outside of the limitations, the limits, the very, very strict limits of gender and sexuality. And, but it's also important to state that there's a lot of variety in regards to drag, as well as there's still a lot of discrimination within the larger drag community, which I think just is about these underlying norms that the LGBT community is not immune to, around heteronormativity and cisnormativity. For example, the drag queen on the left is Peppermint. Peppermint is a transgender woman who performs drag, and she has talked a lot about the discrimination she experienced within the drag community as well as the larger umbrella LGB community, and even the transgender community for being transgender but still wanting to perform drag, and the limitations that she's had to experience because again there's this really strict uh, gender and sexual binary that sort of assumes that if you are going to be a drag performer, that one, that you're cisgendered, and that two, you are homosexual. In reality, that doesn't have to be the case. Again, if drag is about performing, then it doesn't. Then your sexual orientation, your gender identity shouldn't matter. Drag is what you do. Your identity is how you feel about yourself, who you are. And that, in fact, the person on the right is a straight, popular drag performer who has also talked about how he's felt, you know, a lot of questioning and scrutiny by the larger drag community for being, somebody who loves drag culture, is a very much considers himself an ally to the LGBT community, but identifies as being heterosexual. There's also, a whole range of new performances around drag. For example, there's this idea of the diva queen or the female queen, which is a female, cisgendered, more often a woman, artist who adopts the style typical of drag queens. Um, a diva queen sometimes, so diva queens have described themselves as a drag queen trapped in a woman's body. So, but their descriptions include, female to female impersonator, impersonator. And like traditional drag queens and drag kings, diva queens play with traditional gender roles and gender norms to educate and entertain. Diva queens can appear alongside drag kings at lesbian drag shows and are interchangeable with regular, or what we would assume, uh, typically drag queen performances, which are oftentimes male bodied individuals performing as female bodied. They also perform with them as MCs, performers, hostesses, and spokesmodel. And as one, so the person that is on the right, who is a diva queen called Foxy Neek, has said that drag comes down to a sort of self awareness, a self consciousness about playing around with femininity. She adds that while drag for her is primarily about performance, it is also about a rejection of traditional oppressive forms of masculinity, and that's a part of an affinity with gay men as well. I wouldn't say that every diva queen is a feminist, but I would say that a part of them is in some way. And, stepping outside of maybe possibly drag, but just blurring the gender binary, Conchita Wurst is the drag queen persona of 25-year-old Tom Newworth, uh, who was the 2014 winner of Eurovision, and which is a huge, a lot of people in the United States don't know about Eurovision. Not that you need to know, but it's a huge annual contest that brings 36 European countries together for a sing-off. Think of it like a European-wide uh, America's Got Talent, I guess. And Conchita Wurst performed with flowing locks, a full beard, and a glamorous skin-tight dress, and sang "Rise Like a Phoenix," and she won. And she has been sort of seen as this new idea around playing with gender and that it can be socially accepted and so forth. Okay, so we are going to be now moving on to in the next lecture talking about the assignment that it's going to be due on Sunday, which is about you're going to be watching Paris is Burning and Mean Girls and talking about the social construction of gender and gender performance. So stay tuned for that lecture.